Hi, I'm Professor Seth Chandler at the University of Houston Law Center, and this is a bonus video on good visualizations for the course Analytic Methods for Lawyers. In the regular part of the video, I went through a tour of a number of kinds of visualizations that you could create using Wolfram language, and they're similar to visualizations you can create in many other graphics languages, such as ggplot in R, or some of the various Python libraries like I think Seaborn or Matplotlib, etc. But what I want to do in this video is to talk about how to tell a story with visualizations, how to have a visualization that you could present to a jury, to a client, to someone involved in a legal setting that really communicates as effectively as you do when you're simply using English. So the scenario I want to use to illustrate this is the scenario of a tortfeasor. And so the idea is that we have a tortfeasor. They undertake some level of activity and precaution, and that level of activity and precaution is going to determine the revenue, for example, they get from the activity, the costs of precaution, and the expected liability from any accidents that result given the level of activity and precaution that they're taking. So this is a pretty standard law and economics story, and I don't want the focus to be necessarily on law and economics. I want the focus to be on presentation of information. Let's take a look at sort of a first draft of the graph. And to do this, we're going to set up a function here. We're going to have an activity. This is basically the revenue from an activity level of Y. We're going to have precautions are X and activity is Y. We're going to have some expected damages that is the product of the amount of activity they undertake, the amount of damages that they might have to pay for an accident, and then some declining probability based on the level of precautions that they take, right? This is going to decline. The bigger X is here, the smaller this value will be. So that's our damages model. And our precautions cost is simply the level of precautions per unit of activity multiplied by the amount of activity that's undertaken. Let's put it together. The total benefit that the tortfeasor receives depends on whether they satisfy the negligence standard or not. And assume the negligence standard measures your care per unit of activity. If your level of care does not meet that standard, then you do get the revenue from the activity, but you're liable for both damages and you still have to pay the cost of precautions. If, on the other hand, your level of precautions per unit of activity equals or exceeds the negligence standard, which I'm calling cut, then your position is you still get the revenue from the activity, you still have to pay the precaution costs, but you don't have to pay anything in damages. So that's a standard tort story. We'll get that into our friendly kernel. And now let's create a manipulate that shows how changing the cut score affects the well-being of the tortfeasor for various levels of precautions and activity. And yes, this is not a good graph. That's the point. You'll also notice I have commented out some code which would help the graph, but I put it in there just to remind myself as to what I might want to put in the future. All right, so let's evaluate this manipulate, and you can see that as I change the cut score, as I move, as my level of precautions now exceeds the cut, there's this bump up because I no longer have to pay damages. That's basically a story one could tell, although you kind of need me here talking you through what it all means, rather than you're simply being able to stare at this and say, oh, I understand it. Let's see what we can do to help reduce the importance of the human narrator and move towards a graphic that stands more on its own. So the first thing to do is to label your plot. And so one thing we might want to do is to find out where the tortfeasor does best. I'm going to write a little function here that basically says find the best behavior by the tortfeasor when they're always liable. This is like strict liability. Damages are 10. So let's run that piece of code, and it turns out they should undertake a level of precautions of 3.61 and a level of activity of 2.3388. I'll make a little label here, and now what I'm going to do is I am going to first of all plot this with a label, and secondly I'm going to set the cut score equal to the amount of care that the tortfeasor would take if they knew that they were fully responsible for an accident. Right? And so we now are getting a little bit better. At least we have a title to this graph, but I still, and I've set some intelligent setting perhaps as to what the standard of liability should be, but I still haven't labeled my x-axes, my y-axes, my z-axes. This is still a pretty deficient plot. So Professor Edward Tufte is probably the leading figure in the past 30, 40 years on making good graphics. If you ever see something called spark lines or little lines in newspapers that sort of show trajectories, he's responsible for that. And actually he was quite influential in my own thinking about how to do graphics. I was very happy to take one of his seminars many years ago. Yes, he also hates PowerPoint, by the way. He says you should sign your graphics. Just like you sign a brief, you sign another thing you communicate, you should be proud enough of what you have made that you sign it. So we can do this in Wolfram. There's a little signature for me, and let's make that same plot, and it's framed, and it has my name on it. So if someone wants to scream at me, they know who made it. All right, what else should we do? We should label our axes, okay? So I'm going to label them, and I'm going to say not only that it's x and y, but what does x and y and z mean? And so you'll notice I've preserved the signature label here. So let's start getting some axes labels here, okay? So now it's a little more self-explanatory what's going on. I don't think we're home free yet. Also, we ought to talk a little bit about axes versus frame in Wolfram language. This occurs in two-dimensional graphics. So I'm going to show you a number of two-dimensional graphics. In the first one, there are axes, but there's no frame. In the second one, there's no axes, but there is a frame. In the third one, there's an axis and a frame. And in the fourth one, there's no axis and no frame. And so you'll see what these look like. So this one has axes but no frame. This one has a frame but no axis. This one has a frame and an axis, and this one has neither. And so it's useful in thinking through which do you want. There is a feature that I don't mention here that probably I should, which has to do with where the axis labels are located. And maybe this is a rather fine point about Wolfram, but let me see if I can illustrate this. Let's just do a very simple graphic. The plot of sine of x as x goes from -10 to 10. And if I say axes label goes, we'll say x dash the time at which the event occurred, and y the amplitude. All right. Then what's happened is that the graphic has kind of assumed a weird shape, and it's kind of shrunken to accommodate my very long axis label name. So it might have been better if instead of that I put frame label, and in frame label, okay, so why isn't it showing a frame label? It's not showing a frame label because I need to set frame to true. It can't label a frame that doesn't exist. Maybe in some version it will be smart enough to figure that out. But you'll see now the label is under the graphic, so it's not distorting the shape, and the label on the y-axis is rotated, which I think it's sometimes better and sometimes worse. And there are ways around this. You can rotate things, but it gets a little complicated. In any event, that is a digression on axes versus frame in two-dimensional graphics. In three-dimensional graphics, we have axes and a box, but you don't label the box. Let's talk meshes and surfaces. All right, so in Wolfram language, you see all these lines here? These are lines of equal y value, and these are lines of equal x value. Those are called meshes. And while it's very common to use an XY kind of mesh, there are other meshes that you might find useful. And you do this by creating mesh functions. So I'm going to create three different mesh functions here. The first one is going to show us the x and y axes. That's kind of the default. The third is just going to have a mesh for the z axis. And the third one is a sort of a custom mesh, which is going to show how far we are from x star, y star, from the optimal values of x and y. And so let's make a table of these plots and use the different mesh functions, and you'll see how having different mesh functions affects what we see. So here is one in which the mesh is the first coordinate and the second coordinate, the x and the y. Here's one in which we're using the z coordinate only. And here's one in which we're using a custom mesh where we're looking at the distance, the xy distance of the point from the optimum value. How far are we deviating, as it were, from the optimum? So you have, at least in Wolfram language, a great deal of flexibility with respect to meshes. And it's often, this may often be a more useful visualization than is this. It just depends on what you're trying to show. Okay, sizing. This is a big issue. Remember, everyone is not, a youngster with great eyes. You may be presenting to people with older eyes or on a low resolution screen, and you need to think about what size objects are going to appear. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change the font size, the base font size that we use in the graphic. And here I've made those fonts a little bit bigger than I did before. One issue is my image size. I didn't think this through. There are certain recording things with Camtasia which I still don't really understand, but let's shrink the size here to 600. And now at least it fits on our screen better. And so one thing we could do is play around with this. Maybe that's too big. Maybe the base style should be 14. And you can play around, or you might have people who are really visually challenged, and you could have 36, but then it gets so big that the graphic disappears in order to accommodate it. So play around with the optimal font size, and you also, graphics are seldom the case for fancy fonts. You want something that's pretty basic and readable. Label key features. Yes. So remember we found the optimal values before. I guess I did that again. Optimum graphic 3D. What is this code? All right, so we're going to find the optimal point, and we're going to make a picture of the optimal point. The code here, what I'm doing shouldn't concern you that much. What you should be concerned with is I'm going to combine a plot 3D, and let's again reduce that to 600. And let's reduce the base style to 16 with a little bit more information. I think when we see this, it'll come together for you. Right. So now what I've done is to, and I'm going to magnify this or unmagnify this a little bit again so it fits on the screen. What I've done is to label the optimal point. And yes, you can do this by hand in lots of programs, Adobe Illustrator, or there may be a facility in whatever you're using to directly label key points. But it's often useful to do it programmatically because this way, hey, supposing I want to change the damages to 9, okay? So now, I believe, right, we now have, I don't have to redo the hand labeling, it does it programmatically. So this is an advantage of trying to do as much as you can in an automated way so that when you change your mind, you don't have to redo your work. We also ought to consider the domain of the plot. How much of X and Y do we want to show? What do we want to do with very high Z values? So here, what I've done, let's run this piece of code. And again, I'm going to change this back down to 600 and base style 16. And what have I done here, right? I've clipped, in this earlier graphic, my X values went from 0 to looks like 5. And as a result, there's kind of a lot of boring stuff here where nothing very interesting is going on. I might, depends on the context, but I might want to eliminate this stuff. And maybe I don't consider what's going on at these low levels of activity interesting and the very high levels of activity interesting. So I could just restrict the scope over which I'm analyzing matters. I'm going to restrict the domain of the plot. And now, maybe it's a little clearer what's important here, that this is where the tortfeasor will behave under the negligence rule. So consider domains. Consider whether there are better ways to tell your story. That's certainly the case. So I'm going to show you another story here. This one is obviously a fairly complex story. Let's see what the story is. And one thing I can tell you is I am going to change this down to 16 and 600. And I'm going to change this one to 16 and 600. And I think that's going to be enough to fix matters. Okay. So, right. This is a better story. Good job, Professor. What I've done in this graphic is to show you what the position of the tortfeasor looks like if they are subject to strict liability. Where will they optimize matters? They never get the bump when they're under strict liability because they never manage to shed responsibility for damages. And that's the pinkish surface here. And I've labeled the optimal position of the tortfeasor under strict liability. And you can see that it does feature a lower level of activity and actually a little bit lower level of precautions than exists under negligence. Here in a different color, we've got the negligence optimum. And you can see I've got two sets of Z contours here, one showing equal contours on the strict liability surface and one showing equal contours on the negligence surface. I've also made this surface translucent so you can see what's going on beneath it. So is this a better graphic? Well, it might depend on your audience. For a pretty sophisticated audience, I think this is a better graphic. I think it better explains what is often the point, which is to show how the negligence standard can actually lead to excessive levels of activity. But maybe for a less erudite audience, having two surfaces with different colors and two optimums is too much, and you might stick to something a little bit simpler, such as the graphic here. But at least consider your audience just as you do ordinarily. You don't speak to a class of 6-year-olds the same as you do to college students. So consider whether there are better ways to tell your story. Consider 2 dimensions. Okay? I've been presenting in 3 dimensions, and 3 dimensions are cool, but they often make production of the graphics more difficult, and sometimes juries have difficulty with 3 dimensions. So consider doing things in 2 dimensions, and instead of creating a plot 3D, we're going to use a contour plot here. And let's see what we produce. Right. So this is the same idea as this graphic here, the idea of there being 2 surfaces. But here what I've done is to show the contours under strict liability with a legend. Legend is important. And the contours under negligence. And you can see how they're different. You can see where the different optimum points are. And so arguably this is a simpler presentation. It helps if anyone's ever looked at a contour map, if that's something they're familiar with. I don't know that anyone uses contour maps anymore now that we've got, GPS and all, but in the old days we sure did. And so it may be that this is a simpler presentation. You should certainly consider lower dimensional alternatives. Other things to consider are the following: grid lines and face grids. Let me show you some plots with grid lines, without grid lines. Okay, so here we have no grid lines. Here we have little coarse grid lines where every unit we're showing a grid. And here we have very dense grid lines. It depends how important it is that the user is able to match up and realize that, the sine of 0.5 is apparently, I guess it's about, is this the sine curve? Yeah, about 0.5. So consider these grid lines. It may just be visual clutter and you don't need them at all, and just, if you don't need them, don't put them in. Face grids. Face grids are essentially the equivalent of grid lines. Here is the plot with face grids. To me, I don't think this is a great idea. This graphic is complicated enough as it is, and there may be alternative ways of telling your story. Do you really need to be, I don't even know if you can line up and say, oh, look, at 1, the value is, at 1, 2, the value is -3. I just think it's a mess. Sometimes face grids are useful. Scaling. Scaling is very important, okay? The idea is, let's look at this example, okay? And you'll notice in the first graphic, there's no scaling function option. In the second graphic, there is a scaling function option, and let's see how we view these. So here's a relationship with a linear scale, and here is a relationship with a squared exponential scale. And so it just depends how you want to present the information. Again, here's the log normal distribution, the PDF of the log normal distribution without any scaling. You can see, there's a lot of stuff going on that's stretching out over here, and we've kind of compressed the interesting things that are going on here. So maybe what I want to do is instead of having the x-axis be linear, maybe I want to have the x-axis be logarithmic, so I can do that. And now, by the way, you can see the relationship between the log normal distribution and the normal distribution. And it may be a more useful scale where you can see all the exciting things that happen when the x value is, say, below about 3. Or you might want to, instead of having the x-axis be log scaled, you might want to have the y-axis be log scaled. Here, I don't think that's a very good choice because it flattens out everything. But sometimes it's useful. Or you might want to have a log-log scale in which both axes are log scaled and the PDF starts to look a little more parabolic. There are all sorts of interesting scalings in which you can engage. I wish I knew what I had done in that code or that code, but really at the bottom line is I just want to see what happens when I use interesting scaling functions. We're going to take a break here as it does this. We're done. All right, let's see what happens here. Okay. So remember we've seen that logistic sigmoid curve, and it looks sort of sigmoidal. It's S-shaped. Well, here what I've done by using clever X scaling, I've managed to convert the logistic sigmoid curve that underlies, for example, logit model fit into a line. And so that could actually be quite useful, and I now understand what I was doing in this code. You can definitely do what's called faceting in Wolfram language. I won't pretend that it's better than it is in R. R has a language called ggplot or ggplot2, which does, a brilliant job with faceting, but there are compensating advantages here. In any event, let me show you what faceting is. So, supposing we have some data on 1993 US cars. This data might have been more interesting back in 1993, but anyway, we've got some of the dreadful vehicles like the Chevy Cavalier and the Chevy Lumina that were around back then. And now what we want to do is I want to group the data by car type and by drivetrain. By drivetrain, we mean, I think, is an automatic transmission, a rear-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, that kind of thing. So you don't need to understand the code here. But there we go. We've grouped our data, and we have data on the city miles per gallon and the highway miles per gallon for each of these cars. And now I want to do something or other. Let's take a look at what I'm doing here. Right, this is why it is a little easier in ggplot. So what you can see though here is I've now grouped the data, and I'm going to miniaturize this so it fits a little better on the screen. I've grouped the data according to the type of car here on our vertical axis and the drivetrain, four-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, on the horizontal axis, and looking at how city mileage compares to highway mileage for each of these scenarios. So each of these are called a facet, and this is a faceted graph. And you can make these in Wolfram language. I can also show it to you a different way. It's a little simpler perhaps this way. All right, and so I've gotten rid of the these row headers, and instead the information is contained directly on the graphic. Like this is for small four-wheel drive cars, this is for small front-wheel drive cars, this is for compact front-wheel drive cars, etc. So just an alternative presentation. Finally, in some scenarios, you may be able to use animation. Obviously, if all you can do is put a poster up, animation isn't going to help you. But if you can use movies, animation can often be very helpful in showing high-dimensional relationships. So let's take some code here, and let's just run it, and we'll see what it does. All right, so let's do that. And here we've got table. It's basically building a lot of graphs here. And then just, like in a cartoon where you have to draw each cell of the cartoon independently, and then you stitch it all together. That's what we're about to do here. Here we're making each cell of the cartoon programmatically. That's going to create a list of graphics called torts graphics. And then we're going to use list animate to visualize that. I'm going to cut the movie here, and we'll resume when it's done. I'm back, and we're done. And this is, I think, sort of the whole, this to me is the point of the exercise we went through. So I'm now going to show you what happens to the optimal level of activity and precautions as we change the cut score, as we change the negligence standard. Okay, so let's bring this back, and let's just run our animation. And you can see, right there, okay. What I want you to see is As I move the standard and make it higher and higher, I do get the tortfeasor to behave, but at some point I set the standard so high that it jumps back, and basically at this point it's like strict liability. So there are sort of levels in between. Right, I believe the red color means less than you would undertake in strict liability. The blue color means more precaution than you would undertake in strict liability. And the green level means what you would do in strict liability. And so you can actually stretch people's precautions by not having an impossible standard for them to meet. Anyway, that's more of a law and economics talk. My point, though, is that I think this animation is a fairly interesting way of presenting information about the operation of the traditional tort system. By the way, we can also take this torts graphic list and turn it into a exportable movie so that it can live outside of Wolfram language. Let's actually do that. I'm going to rasterize each of the graphics objects. Hopefully that won't take too long. I'm then going to take the rasterized torts graphics and export them to an MP4 file as an MP4. All right, it's processing. Hopefully that was good enough. And now, in a moment, I'm going to drag a MP4 player into my Camtasia window, and you'll see whether that export succeeded. Okay, I've opened up a QuickTime player, and I've opened up the MP4 file I just created, and let's see if it works. And yeah, I think that looks pretty decent. All right, and we can play it as many times as we felt inspired to watch. So, that is the bonus video on how to create a graphic that communicates. As you can see, just as when you write an essay, there's an awful lot of things to think about: grammar, structure, sentence, order. And really it's the same thing when you're doing a visual presentation. You really want to think through the details and make it communicate as cleanly as you can for the audience you have in mind. Thanks.